The candles flickered in the darkness as 17-year-old Celia stood shaking outside the master bedroom door, wearing her mistress's white nightgown. Behind that door waited a stranger, a husband, expecting his bride. But the woman he married hours ago refused to enter that room, and now Celia, still untouched and innocent, was being forced to take her place. What happened in that chamber would send shockwaves through Ashwood Plantation, shattering lives and revealing secrets that some would kill to protect. One night, one unthinkable command, and everything would change forever. If you want to know what really happened to Celia after that door, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any details. The August heat clung to everything at Ashwood Plantation like a second skin, thick and suffocating, even as the sun dipped below the Georgia horizon. Celia had been awake since before dawn, her hands raw from preparing the wedding feast, her feet aching from running up and down the great house stairs at Mistress Eleanor's every whim. Now, as the celebration below roared with laughter and fiddle music, Celia stood in the shadows of the mistress's bedchamber, helping Eleanor out of her elaborate wedding dress. The white silk pooled on the floor like spilled milk, and Celia carefully hung each layer, knowing that a single wrinkle would mean punishment. "I cannot do it," Eleanor whispered suddenly, her voice cracking. The young bride, barely 19 herself, gripped the bedpost until her knuckles turned white. "I cannot lie with him. I cannot." Celia kept her eyes down, as she had been taught since childhood. Speaking to Mistress Eleanor's fears was not her place. At 17, Celia had lived her entire life at Ashwood, born to Mama Ruth, who worked in the kitchens. She knew the rules. Keep silent. Keep invisible. Survive. "Did you hear me?" Eleanor spun around, her eyes wild with panic and something else, something desperate that made Celia's stomach turn. "I said, I cannot do it." Before Celia could respond, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Master Richard's voice boomed through the door, impatient and slurred with whiskey. "Eleanor, it is time, wife. Open this door." Eleanor's face drained of all color. She grabbed Celia's arm with surprising strength, her fingernails digging into dark skin. "You," she hissed, "you will go in my place." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Celia's heart stopped, then hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Mistress, I—" Silence. Eleanor's fear transformed into something cruel and commanding. "You will put on my nightdress. You will get into that bed. The room will be dark. He will never know the difference." "Please," Celia whispered, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "Please do not make me." The door handle rattled violently. "Eleanor, I am losing patience." "Before we continue, I need you to understand that what you're about to hear goes beyond anything you can imagine. If you want to see how this impossible situation unfolds, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because the next 4 chapters will take you on a journey through the darkest corners of plantation life. Now back to that fateful night. Eleanor moved with frantic speed, stripping the nightgown over her own head and forcing it over Celia's trembling body. "You will do this, or I will have Master Richard sell your mother south to the sugar fields. Do you understand me? Louisiana, where slaves die in 6 months. Mama Ruth." The threat pierced through Celia's terror like a blade. Her mother was all she had in this world. At 45, Mama Ruth's body was already broken from years of labor. She would never survive the sugar plantations. "I will know if you told him," Eleanor continued, her voice cold as January frost. "One word about this, and your mother suffers. Now get in that bed, on your stomach, face in the pillows, and do not make a sound." The door burst open before Celia could process what was happening. Master Richard Thornton filled the doorframe, tall, broad-shouldered, with the confident swagger of a man who had never been denied anything in his 25 years. His jacket was already off, his shirt partially unbuttoned. Finally he growled, his eyes adjusting to the dim candlelight. He could barely make out the figure in the bed, exactly as Eleanor had planned. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, hidden in the shadows. Her hand clamped over her own mouth to stifle any sound. Her eyes locked with Celia's for one final moment. A warning, a threat, a plea. Celia buried her face in the pillows, her whole body shaking. She heard the door close, heard the lock click, heard Master Richard's boots hit the floor one after another. "Nervous, are we?" His voice was softer now, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "All brides are on their wedding night. Do not worry, dear Eleanor. I shall be gentle." The bed dipped under his weight. Celia squeezed her eyes shut so tightly that lights exploded behind her eyelids. She thought of Mama Ruth. She thought of survival. She thought of all the ways a person could disappear inside themselves while their body remained behind. What Master Richard discovered in the next moments would set off a chain of events that no one at Ashwood Plantation could have predicted. But that discovery and its terrible consequences would have to wait until his hands touched skin that was not his wife's. The candle flickered, then went out, and in the darkness, Celia felt her innocence begin to shatter. If this broke your heart, write Celia deserved to live in the comments. Master Richard's hands found Celia's shoulders first, and she flinched involuntarily, a reaction that made him pause. Through the pillows, Celia could hear him breathing, smell the whiskey on his breath mixed with tobacco and something else, something mascu. Line and terrifying. "Eleanor?" His voice carried a note of confusion. "Why do you tremble so?" Celia bit down on the linen pillowcase, tasting salt from her own tears. She tried to will herself somewhere else, anywhere else, back to the quarters where Mama Ruth would be sitting by the fire, mending clothes and humming old songs, back to childhood before she understood what it meant to be a woman with no power over her own body. But she could not escape. Master Richard's hands moved down her back, and even through the thin nightgown, Celia knew he would feel the difference. Eleanor was soft from a life of leisure, her skin pale and unmarked. Celia's back carried the memory of a lashing from 2 years ago when she had accidentally broken one of Mistress Catherine's porcelain teacups. The scars were faint now, but they were there. Richard's fingers stopped moving. The room fell into a silence so complete that Celia could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Turn over," he commanded, his voice no longer gentle. "Turn over and look at me." Celia pressed harder into the pillows, shaking her head frantically. If he saw her face, if he knew, Mama Ruth would be sold away. "Louisiana death in 6 months." I said, "Turn over." Richard's hand gripped her shoulder and flipped her roughly onto her back before she could resist. Their eyes met in the faint moonlight streaming through the window for 3 heartbeats. Neither of them moved. Richard's face transformed through a series of ions, confusion, recognition, shock, and then something darker. Something that made Celia's blood run cold. "You," he breathed, and she could not tell if it was a question or an accusation. "You are the kitchen girl, Ruth's daughter." Celia's mouth opened, but no words came out. How could she explain what had been done to her? Richard released her shoulder and stumbled backward off the bed, his face twisted with rage and something else. Perhaps disgust or a realization that he had been deceived. "Where is she? Where is Eleanor?" The words tumbled from Celia's lips before she could stop them, driven by pure terror. "Please, Master Richard, she made me. She threatened Mama Ruth. I did not want—" "Silence!" He roared the words so loudly that Celia was certain the entire house must have heard. But the celebration continued below, the fiddle music and laughter drowning out everything else. Richard paced the room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair. "This is impossible. This is—" He whirled on Celia, who had pulled herself into the smallest possible shape at the head of the bed. "Where is my wife?" Before Celia could answer, a soft knock sounded at the door. Eleanor's voice, shaking but determined, came from the other side. "Richard, may I enter?" "Enter?" Richard's laugh was harsh and humorless. "This is your bedchamber too, supposedly, though I find another woman in our marriage bed." The door opened slowly. Eleanor stepped inside, now dressed in a simple day dress, her face pale but composed. She had clearly been listening at the door, waiting to see what would happen. "I can explain," Eleanor began, but Richard cut her off with a gesture so violent that both women jumped. "Explain? Explain why you sent a slave girl to take your place on our wedding night? Explain why you could not fulfill the most basic duty of a wife?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Do you understand what you have done? The humiliation, I was frightened." Eleanor's composure cracked and tears streamed down her face. "I was not ready, Richard. I thought if I did not know." Richard's face flushed deep red. "You thought I would not notice the difference between my wife and a slave." The words hung in the air, ugly and cruel. Celia felt something shrivel inside her chest. She was not even fully human to them, just a replacement body, interchangeable, worthless. I have not touched her, Richard said suddenly, his voice tight. Nothing has happened. We can forget this madness. Send her back to the quarters with a warning never to speak of this, and you will come to this bed as you should have done from the start. Eleanor shook her head frantically. I cannot, Richard, I cannot do it. Please, you must understand. Cannot. Richard's voice rose again. You cannot. Do you know what our marriage contract stipulates? Do you know what your father promised me? Land, slaves, and an heir within 2 years. How am I to get an heir from a wife who refuses to lie with me? Gee. I've me time, Eleanor pleaded. A few weeks, perhaps a month. Time. Richard laughed bitterly. The entire county knows we married today. By tomorrow morning everyone will expect evidence that this marriage has been consummated. The sheets, Eleanor. There must be blood on the sheets. A terrible silence fell over the room. Celia understood before the words were spoken. She saw it in the way Richard's eyes slid toward her, calculating. She saw it in the way Eleanor's face transformed from fear to something almost hopeful. No, Celia whispered, but the word had no power. Richard moved closer to the bed, his expression unreadable. You are untouched, a virgin still. Celia could not answer, could not breathe. Richard, Eleanor said softly, and there was something new in her voice, something conspiratorial. If we must have blood on the sheets, if we must have evidence, does it truly matter where that evidence comes from? Mistress, please, Celia begged, finding her voice at last. Please do not do this. But Richard was already nodding slowly, the calculation in his eyes turning to cold determination. Send for fresh sheets, he told Eleanor, and lock that door behind you. What happens in this room tonight stays in this room forever. Eleanor fled without looking back, and Celia heard the key turn in the lock from the outside. Write freedom if the fate of this poor girl made you cry. Celia pressed herself against the headboard, her entire body shaking so violently that the bed frame rattled. Master Richard stood at the foot of the bed, staring at her with an expression she could not decipher. The moonlight cut across his face, half light and half shadow. Please, Celia whispered again, though she knew begging rarely moved the hearts of men like him. Master Richard, please, I have done nothing wrong. Mistress Eleanor forced me here. I did not want, I know. His voice was quiet now, almost thoughtful. He moved to the window and looked out over the dark fields where cotton grew in endless rows, tended by hands like Celia's. I know you did not want this. The acknowledgement surprised her enough that she stopped shaking for a moment. In her 17 years at Ashwood, she could count on one hand the number of times a white person had acknowledged her at all. Richard turned back to face her, and in the moonlight he looked younger than his 25 years. My father built this plantation on cotton and cruelty, he said, speaking more to himself than to her. I swore when I inherited it that I would be different, that I would be better. Hope flickered in Celia's chest, small and fragile. Then let me go, Master Richard. Let me return to the quarters. Tell Mistress Eleanor that you will not, that you cannot. And what then? Richard's voice hardened. Face the entire county knowing my wife refused me on our wedding night, watch my business partners withdraw their investments because they believe I cannot even control my own household. Endure the whispers, the jokes, the loss of respect. He hope died as quickly as it had sparked. Celia understood now. He was not a better man than his father. He simply wanted to believe he was. There are different types of cruelty, Richard continued, moving closer to the bed. Some men would take what they want without a second thought. They would use you and cast you aside like garbage. But I am offering you something else. A transaction. A transaction? Celia's voice came out hollow. Blood on the sheets, Richard said bluntly. That is what everyone expects. That is what must be there in the morning. But how that blood gets there? He paused, letting the words hang between them. That could happen many ways. Celia's mind raced, trying to understand. What are you saying? Richard reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a small knife. The blade gleamed in the moonlight. A small cut on your thigh, perhaps, enough to stain the sheets. Nothing more. You keep your innocence. I keep my reputation and we both keep our secrets. And Mama Ruth? Celia asked, because that was still the knife at her own throat, sharper than the one in Richard's hand. Your mother stays here, Richard said. In the kitchen, safe, you have my word. The word of a master to a slave. Celia's voice carried more bitterness than she had ever allowed herself to express. Forgive me if I do not find much comfort in that. Richard's jaw tightened, but he did not lash out at her. Then you understand the world we live in. I'm offering you the best bargain you will get. Tonight, Celia, take it. She wanted to refuse, wanted to spit in his face, to tell him that his kindness was just cruelty wearing a different mask. But she thought of Mama Ruth's hands gnarled with arthritis, thought of the sugar plantations down south, where life expectancy was measured in seasons, not years. Thought of survival, which had always been the only option available to her. "Will it hurt?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Richard answered honestly, "but nothing like what you feared when Eleanor sent you here." Celia closed her eyes and nodded. "Do it quickly." What happened next occurred in a strange blur. Richard approached the bed with the knife. Celia turned her face to the wall, feeling him lift the hem of her nightgown just enough to expose her outer thigh. She felt the cold blade against her skin, heard him whisper, "Forgive me." And then there was a sharp, burning pain that made her gasp. "It is done," Richard said, pressing a cloth against the wound. "The bleeding will stop soon." Celia looked down to see blood soaking into the white sheets, spreading like a dark flower. Evidence, proof, the lie that would become their shared truth. But as Richard turned away to wash his hands, they both heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside, multiple sets of them, and voices. One voice in particular rose above the others. Eleanor's father, Master Thomas Farweather, sounding drunk and happy. "Come now, Richard," he called out, pounding on the locked door. "Time for the bedding ceremony." "Let us in, son. Let us see the evidence of your marriage." Celia's eyes went wide with terror. The bedding ceremony was an old tradition where men of the family would inspect the sheets to confirm the bride's virginity. Richard's face had gone ashen. "They cannot come in," he whispered urgently. "They will see you." The servants' door, Celia scrambled off the bed, grabbing the bloody sheets. The small door in the corner. "I can slip out before." But it was too late. A key turned in the main lock. Master Thomas's key, the patriarch's key that opened every door in the house. The door swung wide, and 3 men stumbled in. Thomas Farweather, flanked by 2 of Richard's uncles, all of them red-faced and laughing. The laughter died the instant they saw Celia standing by the bed, blood-stained sheets in her hands, wearing Eleanor's nightgown. If you felt anger or empathy, leave a like so that more people know about the brutality these people had to endure. Time seemed to stop. The 3 men in the doorway stood frozen. Master Thomas's smile faded first, replaced by confusion, then recognition, then a rage so profound. "What in God's name?" Thomas's voice started quiet. "Richard, explain to me why there is a slave girl in your marriage bed." Richard stepped between Thomas and Celia instinctively. "Father-in-law, this is not what it appears." "Not what it appears?" Thomas's voice rose to a roar. "You dare tell me my eyes deceive me? On your wedding night, I find you with a girl instead of my daughter." He shoved past Richard and grabbed Celia's arm with bruising force, dragging her into the lamplight. "This is Ruth's girl from the kitchen. I have known her since she was born." One of Richard's uncles, Marcus Thornton, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Thomas, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private." "Private?" Thomas threw Celia aside so roughly that she crashed into the wall, the bloody sheets falling from her hands. "My daughter's marriage must be dissolved immediately. This union is a mockery, a disgrace." "No!" Eleanor's voice rang out from the hallway, and she pushed past the men into the room. Her face was blotchy from crying, her hair messy. "Father, please listen. You!" Thomas turned his fury on his daughter. "Where have you been? Why are you not in this bed where you belong?" Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She looked at Richard, at Celia, at the blood-stained sheets on the floor. Celia could see the choice forming behind her eyes. Tell the truth and admit her own fear, or throw Celia to the wolves to save herself. She seduced him, Eleanor whispered. "And I?" Celia's heart turned to ice. "I left the room for just a moment to fetch my brush, and when I returned, she was there throwing herself at my husband." "Liar!" The word burst from Celia before she could stop it. "That is a lie. You forced me here. You threatened my mama." Thomas's hand cracked across Celia's face so hard that she tasted blood. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not, Cal. Your mistress a liar." "But she is lying," Celia sobbed. all pretense of submission gone. Everything was already destroyed. "Master Richard, tell them. Tell them what really happened." All eyes turned to Richard. He stood in the center of the room, and Celia saw the war raging behind his eyes. She saw the moment he made his choice, and her soul crumbled to ash. "The girl is correct about one thing," Richard said slowly. "Eleanor did leave the room, but she left because she was overcome with nerves. While she was gone, this slave girl," he paused, choosing each word like a weapon, "she entered through the servant's door. She removed her dress and climbed into my bed." "No," Celia whispered. "No, that is not." "I was surprised," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger as he built the lie. "And I am ashamed to admit this, but I had drunk too much wine at the celebration. My judgment was impaired. Before I fully realized what was happening, I did not understand she was not Eleanor in the darkness." He trailed off. Marcus Thornton stepped forward. "Are you saying the marriage was consummated with this slave?" "No," Richard said quickly. "No, I realized the deception before. That is to say, nothing of significance occurred. The blood on the sheets is from a small wound she sustained when I pushed her away in anger." It was a masterful lie, Celia realized. It protected Richard's reputation. It protected Eleanor's image as an innocent bride, and it painted Celia as a temptress, deserving of whatever. Punishment came next. Thomas's face transformed to cold calculation. A slave attempting to seduce a white man on his wedding night. That is a crime that cannot go unpunished. "Father, please," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps we can simply sell her away." Thomas shook his head. "No, this requires a public response. An example must be made." "What are you saying?" Richard asked, and for the first time Celia heard genuine fear in his voice. "I am saying there are laws about this sort of thing," Marcus interjected. "A slave who attempts to seduce or force themselves upon a white person can be tried and punished accordingly. Lashes, branding, or—" He paused. "Or what?" Celia heard herself ask. "Hanging," Marcus said simply. "For a crime this severe, hanging is not uncommon." The room spun around Celia. "Hanging, hanging, hanging." "That is extreme," Richard protested weakly. "Surely a severe lashing would be sufficient." "Would you prefer the county think you consummated your marriage with a slave?" Thomas asked bluntly. "Or would you prefer they see swift, decisive justice being done?" The choice was obvious. Celia could see it settling over Richard's face like a death mask. "However," Marcus continued, "there is another option. The girl is young, healthy, and a hard worker. She has value. Rather than waste that value on a public execution, she could be sold quietly tonight before word of this scandal spreads. Sold to a trader heading to the Deep South. Louisiana, perhaps." "No, Celia." Scream was primal. "You said she would be safe. Mama Ruth, Master Richard, you promised." But Richard would not meet her eyes. "That seems the best solution," Thomas agreed quickly. "The girl disappears. The scandal dies before it starts." "I will fetch Jonas," Marcus said, "the slave trader. He keeps a group chained and ready to march south. He will pay well for a young female, no questions asked." As Marcus left, Celia felt her legs give out. She collapsed to the floor. Louisiana, the sugar fields where slaves died in 6 months. The exact fate she had sacrificed everything to avoid. "Please," she begged one final time, looking up at Richard. "Please, you said you were different. You said you were better than your father." Richard finally met her eyes, and what Celia saw there was worse than cruelty. It was guilt mixed with relief. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "But I have no choice." "There is always a choice," Celia said, her voice breaking. "You just made yours. Would you forgive Richard after what he did? Answer in the comments." The next hour passed in a nightmare. Men came and went. Jonas, the slave trader, fat and stinking of sweat, assessed Celia like she was livestock. He checked her teeth, felt her arms for muscle, and declared her worth $400. "Please let me say goodbye to my mama," Celia begged as Jonas locked iron shackles around her wrists. "Please, just 5 minutes." "No time," Jonas grunted, pulling her toward the door. "Got to have my group on the road before sunup." Celia dug in her heels, looking back at the room where her entire life had been destroyed. Eleanor stood in the corner, face buried in her hands. Thomas was counting the money, and Richard stood by the window, staring into the darkness. "Master Richard," Celia called out one final time, "when Mama Ruth asks where I have gone, what will you tell her?" Richard's shoulders sagged, but he did not turn around. "I will tell her you ran away in the night headed north, that we searched but could not find you." It was a final mercy, Celia supposed. Let Mama Ruth believe her daughter had escaped to freedom, rather than knowing she had been sold south to die. A kind lie, the same kind of lie Richard had built his entire sense of goodness upon. "I pray you never sleep soundly again," Celia whispered. "I pray my face haunts your dreams every night for the rest of your life." Jonas yanked her chain hard enough to make her stumble, and then she was being dragged down the servants' stairs, through the kitchen she knew so well, and out into the night air. The celebration had finally ended. Ashwood Plantation was quiet, except for the crickets and the distant sound of someone singing in the quarters, probably Mama Ruth, sitting up, waiting for her daughter to return. Celia opened her mouth to scream, but Jonas clamped a hand over her face. "None of that," he growled. "You be quiet, or I will gag you." Behind the barn, Jonas had his line of captives. 23 other people, all chained together. Men, women, even 2 children. Jonas shoved Celia toward the end of the line. An older man silently helped fit the chain through her shackles. "Where are you from?" Celia asked him quietly. "Virginia," the man answered. "Master sold me when his daughter got married, needed the cash for her dowry." "How long have you been walking?" 6 days now. Lost 3 already. 1 died. 2 tried to run and Jonas shot them." Celia felt her blood run cold. 6 more days until they reached Louisiana. Then the fields, the heat, the impossible work. Jonas cracked his whip. "Move out," he shouted. "We got miles to cover before sunrise." The group moved forward, and Celia stumbled. As they passed by the quarters, she saw a figure emerge from one of the small cabins. Mama Ruth, still in her apron, looking around for her daughter. "Celia." Mama Ruth's voice carried across the darkness. "Celia, baby, where are you?" Every muscle in Celia's body wanted to call out, to let her mother know she was still alive. But she thought of Richard's lie. Let Mama Ruth believe her daughter had run north to freedom. Better that than knowing the truth. So Celia walked forward in silence, tears streaming down her face as her mother's voice faded behind her. The group marched through the night, putting distance between Celia and the only home she had ever known. As the sky began to lighten, she could see her fellow captives, all marching toward the same fate. "Does it get any easier?" Celia asked the man from Virginia. "The walking?" "No," he answered honestly. "But you learn to put one foot in front of the other anyway, because that is what we do. We survive. Even when they try to break us, we survive." Back at Ashwood Plantation, the sun rose on what appeared to be a normal day. Servants moved through the house. Eleanor and Richard emerged from their chamber, and though Eleanor's eyes were red, the household accepted it as tears of joy. The blood-stained sheets were taken away by an old servant who asked no questions. Master Thomas rode out, satisfied his daughter's reputation was safe. The marriage would stand, the families would prosper, and in 9 months there would be an heir. In the kitchen, Mama Ruth worked in silence, waiting for her daughter. When the overseer told her Celia had run away, Mama Ruth nodded and said nothing. But that night, alone in her cabin, she would pull out a small cloth bundle with a few coins saved. Over the years, a crude map drawn by someone who claimed to have made it north, and a letter of passage forged by a slave who could write, were all the tools she had been secretly gathering for the day when she might help her daughter escape. Now those tools were useless. Celia was gone, and Mama Ruth would never know if her daughter had truly reached freedom, or had been caught and killed by patrollers. That uncertainty would follow her to her grave. But the real legacy of that night, the truth that no one could escape, was simpler and more terrible than any of them realized. In trying to protect their reputations, their marriages, and their comfortable lives, they had proven exactly what they were. They were people who would destroy an innocent girl's life rather than face a moment of social embarrassment. Richard Thornton would go on to father 4 children with Eleanor. He would be remembered as a progressive plantation owner, one who treated his slaves with relative kindness and spoke often about the need for reform. But until the day he died at age 53, he would wake sometimes in the night with the memory of a 17-year-old girl's eyes. He lived with the knowledge that he had been offered a choice to be the better man he claimed to be, or to save himself at her expense. He had chosen himself. They all had. And as for Celia, 3 months into her time on a Louisiana sugar plantation during the brutal October harvest, when the heat was still unbearable and the work was constant, she collapsed in the fields from exhaustion and dehydration. The overseer left her lying there until the end of the day, and by the time anyone came to check on her, she had already stopped breathing. She was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property, one of dozens of enslaved people who died. That year, no one wrote down her name. No one sent a message back to Georgia. Mama Ruth would pass away 5 years later, still not knowing whether her daughter had found freedom or met some other fate, but somewhere in the darkness of that final night at Ashwood, somewhere in the chains and the forced march, and the tears no one bothered to wipe away, Celia had learned the most important truth of all. She learned that the cruelty of good people who told themselves they had no choice was somehow worse than the cruelty of those who made no such excuses. Because at least honest monsters did not ask you to forgive them. At least honest monsters did not pretend they were saving you even as they destroyed your life. And at least honest monsters never looked you in the eye and whispered, "I am sorry," as they handed you over to death. The morning after Celia was taken away, a slave girl named Bess was reassigned to serve in the great house. She was only 13 years old, and when Mistress Eleanor called her upstairs on her 3rd night of service, Bess went without question, because that was what survival looked like at Ashwood Plantation. That was what it had always looked like, and what it would continue to look like until the day the entire system finally burned to the ground. But that day was still many years away, and before it came, thousands more girls like Celia would disappear into the darkness. Their stories were untold, their graves were unmarked, and their names were forgotten. By everyone except the mothers who waited in vain for them to come home. This was not a story about villains and heroes. This was a story about ordinary people faced with an extraordinary moral choice. It shows how easily and predictably they chose the path of least resistance, the path that kept them comfortable, the path that protected their reputations, and the path that let them sleep at night by telling themselves they had no other option. But they did have a choice. They always had a choice. They just could not bear the cost of making the right one. Who do you think was the real monster in this story? And don't forget to click on the screen. I have prepared another shocking story for you. Would you like me to find more historical stories about plantation life, or provide a summary of the themes in this script?